All right, so welcome everyone. So tonight we have a lot to kind of talk about. So we're going to be talking about the texturing process for the book. Now there's a lot of information we need to cover, and everything we're going to be talking about tonight is going to be listed right here. So there's a bit, right? And I don't want to do this or show this to you to intimidate you, but just realize we're going to be kind of hammering on these things all week long, and even come next week and the week after that, a lot of these topics we talk about tonight will be reinforced over and over and over. But a lot of these things we talk about will be like our core foundation, and if we understand these concepts that we talk about today, it is going to make you just fly through this application, and you'll have such an easier time. Okay, so the process of texturing in Painter is actually very streamlined. It's not very difficult at all. We do have the videos here on FSO. These are slightly older. If you do watch these, I should be replacing these here soon, if not already. We do have a Google photo album, so everything we will be texturing will be based off reference, right? So we're not making this up in our head. In fact, I do have the book right here in all its glory, a little bit older. This one's a little bit broken, so, but that's okay, right? If we go to the Google photo album, if you don't want to use PureRef, this would be your option, right? So if you don't feel comfortable using PureRef for whatever reason, you'll still have access to all the imagery that we would have otherwise. The only downside is a little bit slower, right? It's only as fast as your internet. If you zoom in, it'll take a couple seconds and then it'll just kind of snap the quality. It takes a while to update, right? But it works, right? It's not bad. I prefer PureRef because, again, one of the benefits is we can keep this on our screen as we work, right? So this is a huge benefit to us. Plus, it's also organized. You can move these around however you see fit. But when you open up the file that we've provided on FSO, so if I go back to FSO real quick, let me move this out of the way. If you download the album here, you'll open it, it'll look exactly like this. So it's all the same imagery, plus it's 100% of the resolution. So if you zoom in, you see it as good as you're gonna get, right? I did not crop these images. I did not down-res them when I captured them. They are 100% resolution, so they're very large. So the download's about 500, 600 megabytes, but it's a lot of data, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and move that out of the way for now. We'll come back to that. We do have some Substance Painter shortcuts, right? If you want to take advantage of that, it's just kind of their documentation. Definitely worth taking a gander at and taking a quick look. Maybe write down some of the favorites that you see on there or the common ones you think you might use. We also do have a fundamentals video, so if you want to dive in a little bit deeper, not required. We'll kind of talk about this at a later time. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to go ahead and jump in Maya. So the first thing we need to do is prepare our asset for Painter, right? Big surprise. So fortunately, the UVs for this particular object have already been laid out, right? And you can see the UVs are just in 0 to 1 space. So that's perfect, okay? The only other thing we need to do is essentially assign a material to the object and then bring it right back into Painter, all right? So in this case, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm just going to hit Shift-T, and I'm going to assign a Lambert, okay? You could technically assign any one of these materials. It would work, but the Lambert's consistent, and I know Painter is going to pick up on that particular name. Now, the reason we want to assign a material and name it is because this is how Painter is going to recognize what we call texture sets back in that application. So this is how we separate multiple objects if we're bringing in multiple objects. In this case, I only have one, but still it's good for organization and just reinforcing that. So I'm going to go ahead and name this book_material. Okay, that's it. We're done. We can go ahead and export this out right now. So I'm just going to go up to File and Export Selection. And we're going to use the FBX format, right? So mine's already set here. You might have to go ahead and select it. If you don't see this on the list, you have to enable the plugin. And for whatever reason, if the plugin doesn't work, OBJ will work as well. But in this case, FBX will be entirely fine. Now, I do recommend keeping this in a nice location. So I'm actually going to save this in my project set. So if I click on Workspace Root, we can navigate to this directory. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a new folder. And I'm going to call this Painter, right? So what I'm going to do is we kind of progress. So things like the table, the washers, the pulley. I'm going to save them all into this directory. And that way, if I, for whatever reason, change machines, go from Windows to Mac, who knows, right? I can grab this entire project set, bring it over, and everything comes along for the ride. I don't have to go searching on my desktop for some arbitrary file. We'll go in here, we'll create another subfolder. We'll call this one Book. We'll go in there, and then we'll save the FBX finally. So we'll call this book_geo. Name it whatever you want. Book_base, book something, as long as you understand and recognize what this file is. And we're done, right? We can go ahead and minimize Maya. Let's go ahead and load up Painter. Now I am using the latest version of Painter. The icon looks just like this, right? So when you launch it, you'll see this interface right here. If you see the old red 3 circles logo, please update your application. There are some changes between the interfaces, okay? One notably being the shelf, now called Assets, has been moved and docked onto the left side of the screen. We'll talk about the interface really quickly, but we won't spend too much time. We'll kind of, again, glance over this more as we progress. Really, the idea is we're just going to get you guys in there. We're going to start texturing, and you're going to learn by doing, okay? So let's go ahead and just start a new project so we can actually unlock the interface, because there isn't a whole lot we can do just yet. So we're going to go up to File and New. We're going to go ahead. We're going to leave the template at ASM, which stands for Adobe Standard Material. PBR stands for Physically Based Rendering. All these acronyms, right? I feel like I'm in a school system. We love our acronyms. VSD, CDF, CDC, right? It's ridiculous. Either way, Adobe Standard Material, Physically Based Rendering, we're just going to leave it at default. That's totally fine. We'll select our file. We're going to navigate to our directory. So I've already got my project set on my desktop. Painter, Book, grab the geo, and click Open. We're going to go ahead and kick up the document resolution to at least 2K, right? Now this is interchangeable at any time. We're never locked in, one of the major benefits of Substance Painter, right? But for now, this is a good balance between speed and quality, right? If we bump it up to say like 4K, depending on your hardware, it'll look great, right? But it might run a little bit slower. And we still want to have some of that performance so we can make those iterations a little bit more easily. For this assignment, 2K will be more than sufficient, and everything you work on, 2K will be fine. We might export some of them at 4K, but we will continue to work at 2K. Everything here is fine by default. Now, please keep UV tile workflow unchecked. This is only if you're using UDIM, okay? If you have this turned on and you start a project, you will not be able to undo it unless you start over. It's not the end of the world. You can still make it work. We can still bring it back into Painter, or sorry, Maya. It just changes the process a little bit. You have to set up an atlas. You have to tell it which method of UDIM you are using, and then it would work, right? In this case, we are not using UDIM, so we don't even need it. Everything else here is fine, right? If we had a camera, it would bring it in. And if it didn't have UVs, it would actually auto unwrap for us, okay? So we're going to go ahead and click OK. And this is probably the default view you'll see right here, the split view, right? You have your 3D view and your 2D view. Thankfully, the camera controls are just like Maya, not like ZBrush. Thank God, right? So you'll feel right at home here. So you're just basically going to hold Option or Alt and do all the same functionality you're used to, okay? If you hit F1, F2, F3, we can toggle between the various views, right? So F1 would be split, F2 is 3D, and F3 would be our 2D. You can also access this right up here, right? F4 apparently will swap between them. I rarely use that. So today I learned. I'm going to go ahead and keep it in the split view here. Let's take your attention right over to the top right. Here's our texture set list. So notice the name that this came in with, right? Book_material. So that pulled the material we assigned back in Maya and essentially assigned it here. This texture set is basically what we're working on, right? So with that texture set selected, this will be the layer stack that is associated with that texture set. So if you bring in multiple objects with multiple texture sets, if you select a different texture set, you'll get a different layer stack that's unique to that texture set. In this case, we have none of that to worry about. In fact, we're going to be using this texture set list so little in this particular assignment, I'm going to go ahead and dock it elsewhere. So the interface is very flexible. I can rip it off and just dock it right back into the layer stack, right? Most of your time would be spent in the layers as well as the properties. So we want to kind of really keep these exposed. I don't want to waste real estate for the texture set list here, okay? Right next to the layer stack, we have our texture set settings. This is where we can set that document resolution. So a quick demonstration of that and what that might look like. So by default, we started at 2K. Actually, the default would be 1K, but we bumped it to 2K. But I can drop the resolution. So if I put it at 128, all my textures immediately update for 128 by 128. And this would be very useful if I were taking this asset to, say, like a mobile title or 3DS or something along those lines. Or if this was an asset that was very far from the camera, I wouldn't need that much resolution to get this to look good, right? So it's less memory impact. But because we're a little bit more intimate with this, we do need the resolution. And thankfully, we can increase that freely, right? So pretty much all the materials and shaders we use right here in this shelf will automatically update as needed, right? Now, if we bring something in custom, I can't always guarantee that based off what you bring in, but this is still incredibly powerful, right? And we can even go up to 4K. So if I zoom in real tight here and you see the little pixelation on this little edge, it's a little feathered. Again, it's just how many pixels we have to deal with. If I kick it up to 4K, looking real smooth, right? Lovely. In this case, we'll keep it at 2K. All right. Now, that ASM PBR standard material that we started with is going to give us this base channels: base color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal. I don't need you guys worrying about that too much just yet, okay? Really, the major impact between these players are simply color is color, right? In fact, if I look at it, right, I can actually click this little drop down here and start looking at those channels. See how it's like base color, height, right? If I tap C as in channel, I can actually cycle through them as well. So there's color, right? Raw color with no shadows or highlights. If I hit C again and look at the height map essentially shows areas that are raised up and areas that are raised down based off value, okay? Roughness will show just essentially how blurry or how sharp a reflection is. So the higher the value, the more blurred the reflection, the lower the value, the more mirror-like it's gonna be. And again, don't stress, right? We're gonna do this over and over and you will start to get really acclimated with this. Metallic simply defines areas that are going to be handled as a metallic surface. Black is non-metallic, white is. And then we have our normal, which we don't see right now because we didn't bake it. But if I were to look at the normal plus height plus mesh, this is what it looks like. So normals actually alter surface normals to give the illusion of high resolution detail. So when I move the light around, you can actually see that surface, right? Write this one down. So as far as moving the light, shift, right click, drag in any of these interfaces. So you can do it in the 2D or the 3D view because you're going to be doing that a lot. Really the most important thing in our texture set settings I want to take your attention to is going to be the mesh maps. This is going to be the most important thing we should do every single time we start a project. Every time, right? A lot of these maps that we are going to generate here in a second are used with the various tools and generators within Painter in order to accomplish their tasks, okay? So we're just gonna go ahead and click on Bake Mesh Maps. We won't even talk about it. We're just gonna leave them all on. We don't even necessarily need them all. It's not gonna hurt us. It's not gonna penalize us. We're just gonna go ahead and kick this up to 2K. So what this is gonna do is gonna use the existing model information and bake that to our baked mesh maps. So we're gonna get all of this information essentially for free, right? You could bake this out in ZBrush, you can bake it out in Maya or XNormal, and you can bring that in. That's totally fine. Whatever baker works for you, that's okay. Typically also the workflow would be like a high-res model to a low-res mesh, right? And you get the high-res data onto the low-res mesh. In this case, we're just using the high-res as the low-res. It's just simpler that way. Let's go ahead and bake. Now, depending again on your CPU and your hardware, this will go either relatively quick or it could take a little bit. It shouldn't take too long unless you really kick up your settings. So now if I hit B, as in baked mesh maps, I can cycle through the various mesh maps. In fact, I can click down here as well. So if I want to look at the ID, here's my ambient occlusion, right? Curvature next. So hopefully your curvature looks like this. If it looks worse, make sure you increase your resolution on your baked mesh maps. You can always rebake at any time. Positional data, thickness, and the normal, which again, since we didn't have a high-res model, we don't have anything here, and that's okay. And then finally, world space normals, all right? To go back to my normal view, you could either go up here, go to your material, right? Or you could just hit M. So if I'm looking at my channels, I can hit M for material to go right back, okay? So again, first thing we always want to do when we start, Name your texture set if you haven't already. The second thing we always want to do, bake your mesh maps every single time. That should be the initial process when you start a project. All right. Now we're kind of ready to dive in a little bit. So let's go ahead and jump into the layer stack here. You can see I still have that aluminum insulator. I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of these layers for now. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about how we interact with, like, say, the shelf here, as well as the layer stack. So the shelf, I hate it as far as it being docked right there. So I'm just going to go ahead and move that down here. All right. The shelf is very, very simple. So what it does is basically what we search for. So for instance, if I search for gold, it's going to find anything with the word gold in it or something similar. Now it does have these various filters along this little top row right here. So right now it's filtering based off materials. So I only get one item with the word gold in it. If I uncheck this, I now have no filter, and now I'm searching the entire contents of the stock Painter installer, right? So this is everything that Painter comes stock with, okay? So you can see old, folds, gold, another gold, right? All of these have that kind of trigger to kind of pick it up, and it was enough for the search to pull up. If I search for leather, I get a lot more resources. So I get things like materials, smart materials, brushes, and textures. So if I wanted to filter out just, say, materials, I can click on that and isolate. Or if I just wanted smart materials, I can do that as well. The biggest complaint I generally run into is this. So if I'm searching for something, for instance, let's say if I search for gold and we look for a brush, right? So if I'm looking for gold, but I was actually looking for the gold material, I'm going to get that no result found because I've filtered by brushes. Okay. So just kind of look here. You can either click clear search, but then you have to type it in again, but it does reset all of this up here. Otherwise, you would just have to toggle the visibility. So if this is checked, just uncheck it and you'll be okay. All right. So it's just something to note there. The shelf also has this little hidden menu right here. This little project menu is going to be super important. Let me clear my search. If I go to the project, any assets I bring into Painter will be visible here. So the only thing that I've brought in are the baked mesh maps that I've baked. So you should see these here within the project. But as we start to progress and we bring more items in, they'll all be listed here. All right. And then I can go back to all libraries. Now, anytime I want to create a layer, we have a couple ways of doing so. So if I look at the layer stack, we have this little toolbar up here, right? So this little magic wand will give us some options right here. You can see they're all grayed out. So these function when I have a layer selected, but right now I have none. These will be our masks right here. We'll definitely be spending a lot of time there. We can create paint layers by clicking on the little paintbrush, and then we can create fill layers by clicking on add fill layer, all right? These two are going to be the most used layer addition options, right? Unless you want to use like preset layers. These will just bring up smart materials, right? Using the mini shelf. So if I click on paint layer, I get, well, big surprise, a paint layer. In fact, if I look in the properties, you can see it labeled as paint. So it's letting me know what type of layer this is, because if I don't, they kind of work a little bit differently. The paint layer I can physically paint to. The fill layer I cannot, right? So I can now paint on my mesh. Fantastic, great. This is what makes Painter so useful though. I'm not just painting with just a color. I'm painting with a material. So if I scroll down to the bottom of my properties here, you can see I'm painting with color, height, roughness, metal, and normal. Now, I don't really have anything exciting plugged into these attributes, but I could change them if I wanted to change the color and the roughness. And now I can paint like a plastic-like material, and you can see it's a little bit more reflective, right? And as I just paint a little bit more, so you can see that better. Now, the problem with a paint layer is I can't really change it after the fact. There are ways we can, but if I wanted to simply just change the color, it's not going to update, right? I would have to paint this again for that to work. Worse yet, if I wanted to like load in a material, I could double click on this. It loads the material into my brush. I could paint this, right? But as soon as I start to paint, you're going to see it kind of stamping on itself, right? So it doesn't look that good, right? It's like, ooh, it's repeating very, very poorly, right? And that's normal, right? That's just how this brush works. So in this particular regard, the paint layers, they're not that great. I'm going to show you better ways to interact with these layers. So I'm going to go ahead and delete layer 1. All right. Instead, if you recall, when I dragged and dropped this, it creates a fill layer. In fact, if you look at the naming convention over here, it says fill, right? I could also do it this way. So if I create just a blank fill layer here, think of this like a Lambert, like I've just created a Lambert, and now if I change anything, it updates, right? So if I want to change the height or the roughness here, now I'm changing the whole thing, right? I can also change the material itself. So if I drag and drop a material of my choice into the material mode, it'll swap out all the channels for that respective material. Or if I want something a little bit more specific, I can technically drag it into any one of these channels individually. So now the height and the roughness and the metallic are no longer being driven by this, only the color, right? The color is now being driven by the aluminum insulator, all right? Just so you know, you can do things like this, right? In fact, you can take any one of these little images here, right, and plug that into the color as well, and that will update accordingly. So now I've taken a texture and plugged it into the base color. Or I can take a material and plug it into the color. Or I can take this Worley 3D noise and plug it into the height and get a completely different result, right? So there's gonna be a lot of experimentation, trial and error. Don't be afraid of that, okay? So let's go ahead and clear out this layer. So what I wanna do is to start building up the texture based off what we see, right? So if we kind of examine the book, you can see it's kind of comprised of about 4 core materials. Now don't worry about the overall, you know, the subtle details, the tearing, the noise, and all that grunge all over it. I just want to get the look and the feel of the core materials. We have leather, fabric, pages, and the gold trim. If we can get those landmarks, then we can go ahead and damage it up and get it to look good. Okay, but let's start with the basics. So first off, let's see what kind of leather options there are built into Painter. Now everything we do for this asset is going to be within stock Painter. We don't have to download anything from the outside resources or websites or anything like that. We don't even have to create anything ourselves. We're keeping it simple this lecture, okay? So I'm going to search for leather. Again, we get all of these options here between smart materials, alphas, brushes, and things like that. The ones I want to take your attention to are both the materials and the smart materials. So if I can filter, right, I believe if I hold shift, can I do control? Okay, it's control. I can actually append. So if I hold control, I can append, and now I'm searching for both material and smart material. Notice the icon differences here. So the material is just a sphere, and then the smart material is this complex shader ball, okay? The biggest difference between these two really isn't the fact that they're different. They essentially both are materials. So if I apply this leather calf grain, it looks fine. It actually looks really, really good, right? No problem there. And the difference between, like, say, this leather bag, right, which also looks kind of cool, is the complexity and layer stack. All right, so take a quick look over here. So the leather bag is defined with one layer. All of its features are accessible in the properties. Simple, right? Nothing is hidden. The smart material, on the other hand, is a combination of multiple layers that somebody had created, which means it could be controlled in multiple different locations. So this is a little bit more complex. It's still fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But for today, we're going to keep it simple. We're not going to dive into the smart materials because it's a little bit harder to modify, especially at your level. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick to just materials. So I'm going to go ahead and just uncheck that. Materials only. Let's go ahead and delete these layers. I'll take both of them and hit delete. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start with this leather medium grain. Now you could just take any one of these materials, like here's leather bag, right? But ultimately I need something that looks and feels like the leather we see here. And this doesn't quite achieve that, right? So if I delete this leather bag and bring in the medium grain, we look at this and you can see, well, I like the frequency, the height, the leather feel, if you will, but the color, nowhere close to what we need, right? So we need to make some modifications. Now, I'm lazy, right? I could go over here and I could sit here and adjust the hue, the saturation, and the value to kind of get the color we need, or you could just color pick it, right? Just bring your cursor over here in the Pure Ref, find a color that feels suitable for what we're trying to do, and go with that. Now, do be cautious. Don't pick like a highlight, right? That's not going to look good. If I pick a highlight, it's going to look completely off, right? And be careful not to pick maybe like this worn leather here, because that's going to be a little bit more saturated than what we're probably looking for. So maybe I kind of like what I got down here, as long as I don't pick one of those highlights. That feels pretty good to me. In fact, I think I'll lift up that value just a little bit so it's not so rich. So let me pull some of that saturation down and pull the value up slightly. All right, and we can always go back and modify this. So this is what's going to make Painter so flexible. All right. So we have the material applied. Shift right click, observe your results by moving your light around. Really study what's going on. We run into a problem though, right? The material is applied to everything. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We could like build on top of that, but if we ever start to get this leather rough and build on top, like, oh great, this covers everything too. Whereas the paint layers didn't, right? So how do we isolate this detail? So this is where the most important concept we talk about tonight is going to come into play, and that's masking. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on my screen real quick. Actually, let's do the type tool. And I'm going to say white is equal to 1, which is equal to true, which is equal to visible. Black equal to 0, equal to false, equal to hidden. All right. So I give you a lot there. Okay, so let me explain. When we create a mask, we control the visibility of a layer. This is no different than in Photoshop or any application that supports masking. This is all the same, right? If that mask is white, we reveal the contents of that layer in that specific area. If the mask is black, it is going to be hidden and reveal the layers underneath, if there is one, okay? I also put this 1 in true, 0 in false for a very specific reason. A value of white is 1. So you have 0 to 1, right? A value of black would be 0. In a Boolean statement, true or false, 1 can also equate to true and 0 would equate to false. So we can actually use color to define statements back in Maya. For instance, if I want a material to be non-reflective, if I put a black texture into it, it is effectively no longer reflective. All right, don't worry about that yet, but just kind of keep that back there in the head. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to right click on this layer and I'm going to create a mask. Now you have a couple of options: white mask, black mask, bitmap, height blend, color selection. We're just going to keep it simple: black mask. You can also click on this icon up here, which will give you just the masks. All right, black mask. So remember, black hidden, so there's nothing visible currently. Now, if I paint in white on this layer, right, I have the mask selected. If I paint in white, I'm now revealing the contents of that layer. If I paint in black, I'm now hiding the result of that layer, okay? If I paint in 50% gray, we get a 50% visibility, okay? This is going to come into play. All right, so for now, I want this to be 100% white. So I'm just kind of setting this grayscale value. I have my mask selected and I can start painting. Now, I need to make the cover and not the pages completely white. So if I scale my brush up, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. You have controls up here to change size. But if I start painting, what you're going to see is it becomes a little bit more cumbersome. Like, oh man, it's starting to paint over here. Now I got to paint in black. Oh crap, it's going over. There's got to be an easier way. Sure enough, there is. All right. So instead of painting directly to the layer, I'm going to paint it a different way. All right. So let me go ahead and clear the mask. So I'm going to just go down, clear mask. Over here, we have our tools. So hitting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on will cycle through those tools. I'm going to hit 4 to grab our polygon selection tool. All right. The polygon fill. And so the way this works is it allows me to grab polygons by just kind of clicking or marqueing a section of polygons. Big surprise. And if I set it to say like triangles, I can grab triangles and do the same thing, right? So if I just marquee a couple of areas, I get triangles. What I want to take your attention to is not these two, it's the last option, UV chunk. So if I grab this and paint in with a value of white and marquee the two shells I want to be white, I can now assign a mask just to those areas. If I tap 1 to go back to my paintbrush, I can now see it without the wireframe. And take a look at what we've created. So we've created a fill layer which floods the entire UV space with this material. We needed to hide it, so we created a black mask. The mask hasn't updated yet. There it goes. We created a black mask to hide it, and then we only revealed it in the areas we wanted to. Okay, and we're going to do this a lot. Okay, So I can still append to this mask. So if I wanted to continue painting, I could. Or if I want to paint in black, I could hide it, right? I'm never locked in. I can always make changes as I go. So let's keep going, right? Let's talk about how we can preview this mask in slightly different ways. This is going to be a great way for troubleshooting. If you hold Option or Alt and left click on the mask, the thumbnail of the mask, you can preview that mask and see the actual value of that layer. So again, if I paint in black, it'll show a black. If I paint in gray, then we know something might be a little bit wrong in this particular area, right? Just by saying, hey, this should be white, okay? If I hit M, I go back to my material view. If I hold Shift and click on the mask, I can temporarily disable it. Also very good for troubleshooting. So Shift click again to turn it back on, Shift click to turn it off. So this is a nice way to just kind of, again, troubleshoot. Now I'm ready to blend in some complexity. So if we kind of look at this, I kind of want to create this worn edge here, right? This is a very distinct look. So I'm going to need at least 2 different types of leather. And we've already got one set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this leather rough and drag and drop it on top. Now we run into the same problem. The leather is covering the entire contents of the book. This is already looking a little bit tedious. Does this mean I have to do it every single time I create a layer? No. Let me show you how we're going to do this. All right. So initially we created the mask on just this leather. Technically, I want the same mask up here. We could copy and paste the mask and that would work, right? But in this case, I need a little bit more finesse because what I'm going to end up doing is using another generator to drive this. So let me show you the problem we're going to run into, right? You don't need to copy what I'm doing. I just want to show you. So if I copy this mask, I can paste into the mask. So now I have the same mask, but we're going to be using a generator to create this grunge effect right here. So if I connect in something called a metal edgeware using a generator, we'll talk about this here in a second, you're going to see it completely replaces the mask that we just created, and now it's painting again the areas I intentionally tried to hide. There are ways around this through this method as well, but I'm going to show you a better method. All right, so let me get rid of this. Let me delete this mask. Remove mask. So what we're going to do is we're going to take both of these layers and we're going to group them. We're going to create a folder. So you can either click on this little folder icon right here. If you create it from up here, it won't be embedded into the group, so you have to kind of move them manually, right? Or if you just kind of grab both layers and hit Control or Command G, that will group them as well. Now this has major benefits, all right? So let's go ahead and name this, call this leather group. And in fact, we can color code this. I'm going to do red. So anything within the contents of that group is now color coded. But here's the cool thing. If I put the mask on the group, the contents in that group will be restricted to where that mask is allowing it to be visible, right? Think of this as like a parent-child relationship from back in rigging, if you've had that class, right? The same thing is being applied here. If the parent says you can't be seen here, the child has no option other than to oblige, right? In this case, we're just going to say the child can't talk back, right? So the parent has the ultimate control, if only, right? So I'm going to go ahead and take this mask, copy it, and paste up here into the group instead. Now you could go through the traditional route. You can create the black mask. You can grab the UV chunk. You can marquee that section. It would do the exact same thing. Or again, since we already have that data, we can just paste it right into it. Okay. Now look at what's happening. Do you see how the leather ruff, despite having no mask, is already hidden in this area? Perfect. That's exactly what I need. In this case, I technically don't even need the leather medium grain anymore as far as the mask is concerned. I can remove this because the mask in the group is doing the work for me. Now I can use a mask as a method of blending between the two layers, because right now the leather ruff is just completely visible on top of the leather. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create a new black mask on the leather ruff. And now what we could do is we could paint it, right? But that's going to be very tough. That's a hard sell to get this to look organic by just hand painting it. So this is where we're going to take advantage of those generators. So Painter has several ways to create masks. Fill layers, paint layers, generators, filters, you name it, right? Very, very powerful. This is one thing that I have a couple complaints with. The generators tend to be very useful for starting points, My complaint is I see too many students and even professionals over rely on it. And you can go in ArtStation right now and be like, yep, metal edgeware, dirt generator, metal edgeware, and you can call them out and be like, you didn't do anything. Where's the artistry, right? So I'm going to show you guys how to control this. So we're going to go ahead and right click, and we're going to connect a generator to the mask. All right. So before, for this mask right here, for the leather group, we painted it. We essentially grabbed the UV chunk, painted it white, it was visible. Now we're going to be generating a mask based off the generator we connect to it. So we'll click on the little generator button, find the generator we want to use. Basically, any one of these should work. Experiment. You can create your own as well with the mask editor here. In this case, I'm going to keep it simple, metal edgeware. Let's load that in. Now it works, right? It gives us this really cool result. In fact, if I just go full 3D here by hitting F2, I can just kind of inspect my result. Now, if yours goes completely leather, right? If it looks like this, something was wrong, right? If you scroll down into your settings for the leather, or I'm sorry, the metal edgeware here, and you see giant red X's, this means you need to go back and bake your mesh maps. If these are disconnected, see how it doesn't work, right? I could just turn all of this off. Actually, this gave me black, but if these weren't there, it would just break, right? It would just be white. Okay, so don't worry about that. Don't delete those, please. So now let's take a look at some of these settings. So we have wear control, right? So we can kind of play with that. We have wear contrast, which is going to do exactly what you would think it would do. We have grunge mount, edge smoothness, and curvature weight. So the major player I like to play with is actually curvature weight, because a lot of this is actually being generated from the curvature map. I know this just from experience, right? So if we kind of pull this back, we can take some of that intensity away from the edge. That's really what we're looking for, just a subtle imperfection on that edge. I can bring the wear level up maybe a tad, maybe kind of tweak that contrast. I already got it pretty high. I don't want it to be like super grungy. All I'm looking for is that nice little edge wear. And there we go. So with a little bit of curvature weight, a little bit of wear and wear contrast, we're sitting pretty, right? If I want to kind of tone down this little wear here, we can adjust the grunge amount. That's where that kind of comes from. But I kind of like a little bit. That's okay. But again, we run into the problem where it just looks like a typical metal edgeware, right? So this is where we got to go in and finesse it. So if we look at our reference here, you'll see we have this little notch in the corner of the book. So we can create that. And if we look at the spine here, you can see it's not completely worn, but we do have some worn corners here that we might want to touch up on. So let's go ahead and do that, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to my leather rough, right click, and add a paint layer. So I can append layers on top. So the layer stack is going to build from the bottom up. So it does the metal edgeware first, and then the paint layer is what I'm going to do next, okay? Now, by default, I have a pretty lame brush, right? Just a soft, you're going to have a soft feathered brush, right? By the way, yours is probably going to be in brush outline cursor mode here, so you won't even see the color. If you set it to full preview, you'll get the color. I would recommend full preview. It's a little bit easier to see, especially if you've accidentally plugged a texture into your brush. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for a brush. So let me toggle this, search for all brushes. Let's remove our search parameters here. And I'm just going to double click on this heavy sponge. All right, so we'll load that in. So now we get this kind of really cool, a lot more organic brush. And so what I want to do is kind of touch up in some areas. So I'm going to bring that size down a little bit, and we're just going to kind of paint. Now I'll talk about the hotkeys here in a second, but I'm just going to go ahead, and you can use these up here. I'll go ahead and kind of position these in such a way where I kind of create that nice little arc. If I hit X, I can invert my colors and paint in black. So again, I'm controlling visibility, right? So if I paint in white, I reveal, black will hide. If I go over here to the corner, I can start to touch up on this. So if I want to kind of wear away the corner a little bit more, we can absolutely do that. So actually, how about I just tell you the controls right now? So if you hold Control or Command, you can see down here in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, Control, left click. So if I hold Control or Command, if I say Control, think Command if you're on Mac. If I hold Control, right click, drag left and right, I can change the brush size. Control, right click, up and down will be our flow, or I'm sorry, our hardness. Control, left click, up, left and right will be our flow, and Control, left click, up and down will be rotation, okay? and then X will be our toggle. So it's flipping it based off where the color value is. So if it's in the middle, it'll just kind of flip in that same range. So in this case, let's go ahead and paint in black. And I can start to hide that worn leather and just have that little niched or notched edge there. And that might look pretty cool. All right, maybe kind of drag that off a little bit so it doesn't look too procedural. Right? And so I would expect you guys to kind of go around and touch up on the book a little bit. Now we're going to be covering a lot of this with fabric here in a little bit, so it's not something you necessarily have to do now, right? Just be aware that we can add paint layers and continue appending that information. All right, so we have our leather. Let's go ahead and collapse that. Let's go ahead and generate another layer. So let's move on to the fabric, right? So if we think about this in a logical order, this book was probably leather at first, and they put the fabric on it, and then the gold trim was added last, and that's fine. So we're just going to kind of repeat that process. So if I search for fabric, I could type. We don't get anything, again, because we have brushes filtered. I'm just going to uncheck that, and then filter by materials, and take a look at what we have. Now, we have quite a few of these, right? And some are definitely going to look better than others. In this case, I'm going to go with the fabric baseball hat. All right, it's simple, it's going to work, it's going to give us the result we want. Now, traditionally, if you didn't know, you would just kind of throw something on there, see what it looks like, and be like, yes, no, maybe, probably not, right? Fabric baseball hat will work. So let me go ahead and drag and drop that onto the surface. Now, I like this one because it has a lot of high frequency detail. Once I start getting this tiled correctly, you can kind of see those lines in there, and that's what I'm trying to create right there, these little lines kind of going from left to right. Obviously color doesn't match, but I think we've got a bigger problem here. You see how that leather pattern is kind of seeping in through the fabric? That's going to be an issue, and that's going to be a recurring issue you're going to see a lot. So we need to prevent that from happening, okay? It's actually very easy, but we just have to understand this. So this entire time up here in the layer stack, we've been looking at our base color. So that's why all our thumbnails look like color. And if you look, we have blend modes over here in the top right. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, it's the same thing, right? By default, normal blend mode just means sit on top, don't blend, you're just kind of your own thing, right? Unless the mask tells me to hide. If I look at, say, the height channel by clicking on this little drop down and going to the height, you can see it's set to LDGE, or linear dodge. Linear dodge is actually an additive function. So it's taking the height of one layer and adding it to the height of another. So in this case, we see the leather plus the fabric. So in this case, I want to prevent that from happening. So if I go from linear dodge to, say, normal, the blend no longer occurs, okay? It's a really important concept. This is going to creep up on you, I promise. And in fact, if you're really paying attention here, do you see how my leather ruff is also blending? So maybe I don't want that either, and I just want that to be kind of its own entity, right? So now when I look at the leather ruff here, it's a little bit cleaner, right? It doesn't have that height blending through. It was subtle, but it was there. So I'm going to leave that at normal, actually. Let me turn the fabric baseball hat back on. Now here's another problem. If I group this, which I would recommend we do because this is going to help us organize multiple layers, if I group it, that problem comes back. You're like, could they make it more complicated? The layer is still set to normal, so that's correct, right? That's not the issue though, because remember, the parent is a collection of all the contents within. So now the parent is adding its result back in. So now we have to set the parent or the folder to normal. Thanks, Painter. And the problem solved. And now technically, I could actually leave this back at linear dodge and it wouldn't add back in. But for this case, I'm going to leave this set to normal. It's not a big deal. Now let's talk about texture scale. The biggest issue I see with a lot of student work is students don't consider the scale of the texture they're applying. We get bricks that are really, really small, or bricks that are really, really large, or fabric that is completely out of scale. In this case, I need to tile this a little bit more to better match my reference, right? This should not be a large thread. So what I'm going to do is with that layer selected, we can go back to base color. It doesn't really matter. You can be in height and still edit this. I'm going to go down into the UV transformations down here, right? And all I'm going to do is take the scale and tile it 3 by 3, just like that. So now what's happening, it's effectively, if I put this back to 1, Do you see how this bounding box covers the entire 0 to 1 space? That is one repetition of the texture. If I go to 2, I can now put 2 by 2 side by side. So we actually get it like 4 times, right? And if I do 3, that's the result I kind of want. I can move this around by moving this or even rotating this. So you do have that kind of functionality. So I don't necessarily have to move it here with the rotation or offset. But just realize we're essentially tiling this texture more and more. And in fact, if I were to turn repeat to none, I could actually position this very specifically, but we're not going to do that. We're going to leave repeat on. Let's go ahead and change our color. So again, I'll go ahead and color pick this. Let's get that nice dark green right there. Looks pretty good. I like that. Maybe a little bit more green. So let's up that saturation. So that's still in the blues. I'm going to shift that hue into the green intentionally. So that's probably a bad color pick on my part. That looks good. That looks real good. Now we have the problem again where it's kind of applied to the whole thing, right? So I don't want that. So we're going to go ahead and mask the group again, because this will allow me to blend between multiple layers. So we're planning ahead. Like we want to be able to put all of this wear and tear on the fabric, and this is how we're going to do that. So let's name this. We'll call this fabric group. We'll give it a color. Green seems suitable. We'll mask the group, and let's go ahead and paint this in. Now I have this old brush in there, so that's going to make it a little bit more cumbersome, right? So what I'm going to do is load in a basic hard brush. Again, because I have these filters on, we'll just search by brush, double click on this, and we're good to go. Now, for those who are using tablets, I would encourage you to turn pin pressure off for this particular setup. And you could do that right here, right? The problem with pin pressure is when I click and hold shift and click again, yours is going to shrink, right? Because it's using pin pressure. I'm using a mouse right now. If we turn that off, we'll get a nice, straight, consistent line, all right? If you right click, you can also access the various options within the brush, or you can just go down in here into the attributes themselves. All right. So the goal here is to create a mask. Well, that simply looks like this. All right. And again, we'll have to do this on both sides, top and bottom. So let's talk about another new feature, symmetry. This little guy right here. So if I turn this on, you'll see I can now paint across the symmetry line. Now, obviously, this axis is not what we want, so we can go to our symmetry options and do it along Y instead. Okay. Now, I don't necessarily want to paint in the 3D view. It's a little harder to kind of, landmark this or draw this straight. So I'm going to go ahead and do this in the 2D view. So I'm going to hit F3. We're going to zoom in. And in fact, if I want to kind of get some better real estate here, I can hit Tab, right? I can still work in full screen. Everything is just going to be docked over here. Now, if I paint, you'll see it is painting on the other side, but this side's a little hard to see because of the lighting. If I hold shift and right click, you can see it update. If I want to kind of ignore the lighting, hit C until you get to your channel, or your base color, I should say. Now, when I paint, it's very easy to see, right? Or if you're more comfortable, I can do this in a split view, so I can kind of see the depth I'm drawing at, right? Because this should be, I should have about that much depth between where the leather kind of begins and ends until the fabric begins. So let's go ahead and draw. Now, if I bring my cursor over here, you're going to notice it kind of spazzes out. So we can fix this as well. Also, if I paint, notice how it's kind of painting across the seams. Normally that would be good, right? Because if I were painting in 3D, that makes sense, right? Like, okay, that makes sense. I painted across the seam. But it actually recognized when I painted in 2D space to paint across the seams here as well, right? In this case, I don't want that. And you're like, so many settings. If I right click and go all the way down to my brush settings, I can change alignment from wrap, which means jump across UV shelves, to UV. And this way when I paint, it stays within its respective UV shell. So it doesn't cross, well, doesn't jump ship, if you will. I can also set the size space, which is currently set to object, to texture. And this will now keep the brush size locked to basically my texture, right? So you can see it's no longer spazzing out. And now I can draw this a little bit more easily. So if I just go in, scale that brush down, or actually we can keep it slightly large. I'm going to click, I'm going to hold shift and click again. That's going to give me a straight line. Again, one more time, click, hold shift, straight line. Let's go ahead and do the corners. Now, if we want to do like a 45 degree, I can click, hold shift, and then I should be able to, if I hold control or command, right? So again, Command on Mac. So I'm holding two keys right now, Shift and Control. I can snap in increments. So now I get that perfect 45. So I need that to be a little bit deeper. Something like that feels pretty good. And something like that feels pretty good. Okay, so again, clicking and holding Shift will allow me to do a straight line. As soon as I hold Control or Command, I can snap in increments. Okay, so let's just fill in the rest. And you could be loose with this, right? If you screw up, just undo or paint in black, right? It's not the end of the world. Probably do it right the first time. Now I'm going to intentionally feather my brush because I actually had the hardness set to 1 intentionally. But let's say I kind of painted in like that. All right, and you can see that kind of bled over, but that's okay. We can fix that. I do have some impurities in my mask, but some people will miss that, right? They're like, okay, that looks cool. But again, if I hit Tab to go back to full screen and I hold Option and look at my mask, it becomes a little bit more clear where there might be mistakes. So I do encourage setting your hardness when you're painting this to 1. It just makes it a little bit easier. All right, and then I can kind of clean that up as well. If the brush is too big, it will still paint across UV shells. So I can just touch that up, make sure there's no visible gaps in my mask, and we're all sitting pretty. Now I can hit F2, hit M to go back to my material view, turn off my symmetry, and take a look at what we've done. We have our fabric. All right, not too bad. Again, the hardest part is probably the blend of the height. We tiled this, we masked it, we got it laid out where we need it, we've made some brush settings, and now we're moving on. Let's create the variation we see in this texture. All right, how are we going to do this? So we've talked about painting masks via painting. We've talked about creating masks via generators. I'm going to show you another way we can generate a mask. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this fabric baseball hat. So I'm going to get a secondary layer right on top. Let's go ahead and change this color to like a light color green, something like this. So this layer is now sitting on top. Notice the mask is still controlling the visibility of the contents, right? So they're still restrained. What I'm going to do is mask this fabric baseball hat copy 1. Let's give it another color or another name here. We'll say color variant 1, right? Right click, black mask. Now again, you could paint it. You could find a custom brush, but honestly, it's work, right? Let's use something different. I'm going to right click on this mask, and instead of driving it with a generator or a paint layer, I'm going to do a fill layer. So a fill layer is going to flood the surface with a solid color, whether it's white or black or somewhere in between. This is not the real benefit here. The real benefit comes when we start to plug in textures. So if I search for something called grunge maps with no filters enabled, right? Just make sure you turn those off. We get all of these textures you see down here, right? And depending on what we plug in, that will now control the visibility. So if I plug in something like this grunge dirt scratched, this is what I get. Or if I replace it with this one, this is what I get. Notice the interesting variants I get just for free. I haven't modified anything. I could still tweak the scale here. I could tile this a little bit more. I could play with the balance. I could play with the contrast and get a completely different result. But depending on which texture you use, that's really going to be the driving force of the quality you could expect. So if I use something with a lot of brights in it, I can expect to see a lot of that layer come through, and where the mask goes dark, we see the layer beneath it, right? So in this case, I want to use something with very little contrast. I want to get that nice range in my texture. So I'm going to use Grunge Dirt Muddy, right? I really like this one. I'm going to take that, swap it out in the grayscale, and take a look at what we get. We get this beautiful range between the brights and the darks, right? So we never go 100% to this bright color because the mask never goes 100% white. But I could adjust the balance by taking that up, right? Or if I want to go down, right? So I want to kind of find that sweet spot where I get a really nice kind of blend between the two layers. And we get something like that. Easy peasy. And I can take this even further. If I duplicate this again and I do color variation number 2, I can swap out this mask for something else, right? Let's do, I don't know, let's do these Grunge Maps 04 here. Let's get some spots on there. Now that's a little busy, right? That might be a little too much. But check this out. I can pull the balance back. I can get a little less. Maybe I change the color. Maybe we get some of these more saturated greens in here, right? We get some specific wear patterns over here. So let's go ahead and color pick this. See what that looks like. That looks pretty cool. I like that. Maybe I kind of tweak that balance even further until I'm satisfied. All right, so we can take that balance up a little bit more. I kind of like it faded. Or what I could do, instead of adjusting the balance, I could adjust the opacity of the layer and fade that out. All right, so the opacity just controls how intense or how visible that is as well. And there we go, right? And we could just keep layering these effects as much as we want. And this is how you're going to create all of that chaos on the fabric very, very easily. So we're good with the fabric. Let's go ahead and collapse that. Let's go ahead and add the gold trim. This is going to be no different, right? So if I create gold, I'm going to use gold pure, drag and drop. Now we got ourselves a really nice posh looking book. In fact, we could do some fun things here. If I want to enable some depth, or not depth of field, but I want to do some glint. Yeah, buddy. J.J. Abrams would be proud right now. All right, we're not doing that. Post-process effects. So let's go ahead and group this as well. We're going to call this gold group. We'll give that a color. I say yellow seems fitting. And we're going to go ahead and create a mask on this as well. But first, let's get our height situation resolved. So remember, if we go into the height channel and we set the group to normal, that should resolve it. It didn't this time. Why? So oftentimes you will have to do some troubleshooting. Not every material is created equal in Painter. Notice here, right, if I go back to base color, you see how we get a little thumbnail preview? If I go into height, we get a little preview of the height as well. But at the gold pure, it's a checker pattern. Checker pattern means nothing, right? There's nothing there. There's nothing to blend. So even though I set it to normal, there's nothing to blend, right? So it doesn't work. If we look at the gold pure itself, you can see the height's actually disabled. But if I turn it back on, I turn it back on, right? That's it. And now I can adjust things like the roughness, kind of get that gold just the way I like it. I can adjust the color, the metallic, whatever we need, right? Let me go ahead and clear this annotation here real quick. I think you guys have got that by now. All right, so we got our gold pure. I'll switch it back to color. Same idea, create a mask, black mask. All right, now I have a standard hard brush here. I'm gonna just scale that down. We're gonna paint this in. Now I could turn on symmetry, but this mesh isn't 100% symmetrical. So if I kind of did this, it might not go all the way through. All right, so I'm just gonna draw it by hand, not a big deal. Now these are really thin lines if you study the reference, so make sure that brush is nice and small. I'm just kind of clicking, dragging, clicking, and dragging. Now you can notice my metal edge wear for that leather rough needs some touch-ups, right? Oh, I left symmetry turned on. Dope. Not a big deal. We can just finish out. That looks good. Go up here. That looks good. Again, don't forget we can hit C and go into just the color if necessary, if that's easier for the C. And then we can hit M to go right back to our final result. There we go. Getting the gold. Let's do the pages. Now, if we search for pages, there's nothing. If we search for paper, we get a lot of alphas. And if I scroll down, yeah, there's nothing here that looks like paper, pages, or anything like that, right? We're not always going to be fortunate enough to have exactly what we need within Painter, but there are options outside. I will show you that, but we're going to actually build it within Painter, but I just want you to be familiar with the other resources out there. So Substance Share is a community-driven website. And what I love it, this happened earlier too. So if you just search Substance Share, so that's like a broken link in their application. How amazing is that? If you go to the Substance Share site, you'll get access to a bunch of free materials. All you have to do is log in and download whatever you see, and it works, right? It'll go right into Painter, and you can use that as a material. Now, these are smart materials. Again, remember how we kind of talked about the signature features of a material versus a smart material? And that's fine, right? If it gives you what you're looking for, go for it. So if I search for paper here, I don't quite get, I can't really tell what this is. Let's kind of enhance that. That's actually not too bad, right? It doesn't give me like a bunch of pages though, right? So let's go back and search for pages. Nothing, right? So again, we're going to run into this limitation of what somebody has created. I mean, ultimately we could create it too, right? And upload it to this. There's another site called Substance Source. Now, this is not free. They do have some free assets here, But this is basically where all the high quality assets are. So if we kind of filter by assets here, they now just introduced models. So if you need assets, they do provide them, right? And these are some pretty high quality. I believe some of these are scanned in data. But really what we're looking for is materials. So if we kind of look, here's 35 different paper, right? And so, maybe we get lucky in here, right? Or if we need something more metal-like, tons of different metals, ground, ton of that as well, right? So there's over 7,000 materials here to kind of play with. So again, the options are there. And when you're working in a production, you're not always going to make everything from scratch. Oftentimes you'd be like, I need this, and you start blending them together. I mean, it's art, right? It's still art. But I mean, if you can still create it, you still get the most control out of that. All right. So again, we're going to go ahead and just develop this within Painter. So we're going to use something what you might not predict. We're going to use wood, and we're going to use this wood rough. Now, if I drag and drop and place this right on top, you can see it does cover the whole thing. So we'll mask it. We'll call this pages group. I'll create a mask, black mask, and let's just isolate it to just the pages. So I'm going to use that polygon selection again. So I'll hit 4. It's already set to UV chunk. I can single click it if I wanted to, or I can just like marquee it in UV space as well. And that'll do the trick. Now, obviously the wood doesn't look like paper, right? Not even close. But what we're going to do is we're going to kind of force the hand a little bit. We're going to modify this material to look the way we want it to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tile the texture horizontally multiple times and only once. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to tile it multiple times vertically and only once horizontally. Let me show you. So if I go into my UV scale here, I'm going to unlock it, and I'm going to tile it 16 times in the V direction. So what this is doing is tiling the texture 16 times vertically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 16 through the entire UV space, and 1 time horizontally, right? Now I can kind of move this around and get that exactly where I want it, but there's no need to move it, right? I could just leave this at 0 and 0. I'm just kind of showing you. And so it essentially squashes the texture and kind of gives us something that looks like paper. So it's just kind of a clever trick, right? Now, I probably still need to adjust my color, get that to look a little bit better. So we can go ahead and do that. This is a little bit more saturated, so let's go ahead and pick from that. That's a little rich, so I'll tone that back as well and maybe darken that a little bit. I'll get something like that. If I kind of observe, it looks pretty good. Now I do want to create some grunge here as well, so we'll do the exact same thing, right? So just like we did for the fabric, just like we did for the leather, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this wood rough. I'm going to darken this unquestionably dark, right? Questionably dark, not unquestionably, very like, what the heck is he doing? Create a mask on here, and we're going to drive this mask using a dirt generator. Generator, dirt. Generators pull, or this generator in particular, pulls from the ambient occlusion, which just so happens to build up a lot of dirt in this particular area. That actually looks pretty good. And now I can kind of control the intensity, or even the value. If I go back and adjust the value, maybe that's a little too dark. I can lift that up a little bit and get this really nice kind of beat up grunge, right? Again, we can add to this. So if I want a little bit more spots or some imperfections in there, this is just the start, right? We don't have to settle on one layer. We can add another layer. So if I add a fill layer above it, notice what happens. Notice how the dirt got lost? It's being replaced by this fill layer. Think back to the blend modes. Normal means nothing, right? Just sit on top, don't blend. But if I want to add, keyword, add this result to the fill layer, I need to set this to linear dodge add. And now the result is there. It's adding together. Now I don't want to just leave this blank, right? Absolutely not. I want to connect something in there. So let's see what kind of grunge maps I have. In this case, let's go, oh, I don't know. Let's try grunge stains spots. Actually, I'm going to go, yeah, grunge stain spots. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. We can always change it out. And we get something like this. I can adjust the balance. You can see those kind of coming in. It was a little large, a little busy. But you know what? The dirt's still there. Right? So how about I just fade this out using my opacity and make it super, super subtle. And there we are. See how quick and easy this is to manipulate? And if I don't like it, just change it out, delete it, try something else. Right? Not a big deal. All right, so let's put some finishing touches on this bad boy. Let's get the spine of the book done here. So we're going to introduce a few new concepts on how we can kind of create this effect right here. It's actually not going to be difficult, I promise. So we're going to go back to our gold, right? So we've got this beautiful organization going on, right? I can even color code the pages. I'll make it purple. Make it whatever color you want. But now if I want to like make additions to say just the gold, I have a nice localized area to do that, right? These groups are going to be vital for organization later on. Not critical for this assignment. You could technically do it without, but I wouldn't encourage it. I'm going to go ahead and start appending additional paint layers, right? Now I painted initially to just the mask. That's fine, but I'm going to start getting a little bit more creative here, right? I want to get more specific. In fact, actually, I don't even want to do a paint layer. I'm going to do a fill layer. So if I add a fill layer, because again, what we're going to try to do is this little square box. So let's see how we can do that. So fill layer floods the whole surface with just a flat color. Again, it's replacing my existing data, but I'm going to swap this for a texture. And I'm going to search for square. Now, again, I wouldn't expect you guys to know this right off the bat, like what's in Painter, right? Again, you'll kind of figure that out the more you practice, the more you spend time in here. But this is what I want to take your attention to is this shape border square. I'm going to take this, plug it into the grayscale. And so what I get is this giant square texture that is tiling. So if I set the tiling to none, I can now start to position this, right, however I see fit. Now, that's really thick, right? But with most things in Painter, I do have some additional controls to make modifications. So the materials, I can change the color. The brushes have different controls with jitter. In this case, my alpha has the ability to change the border width. And because this is a fill layer, it updates, right? And because this is also a fill layer, I can move this around and scale it to exactly where I need it to be. So if I need a square right over here that's more rectangular, if we do this in our split view, we can see this even better. All right, take a look at that. Maybe a little bit thicker. Done deal. Maybe I need to kind of match that thickness right there. All right, take your time with this. Try to get this right. Bingo. We got our gold square box. Now, if you look at this, there's two, right? So we can either repeat this process. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and name this box. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm just going to hit Control D. And I'm going to hold Shift and drag it down. And if I hold Shift, it'll kind of snap it vertically, right? So, or horizontally, depending on which way you start. And now I have my secondary box. See how quick and efficient this is? Now I can kind of position this wherever I need. So I'm going to go ahead and just hide that for now. Right, I'm not too worried about that. I'll let you guys handle that, okay? I guess I'll just leave it visible, not a big deal. Now, I got to be careful though, right? If I go back to this original box and I move this over, notice how the gold line here went missing? Technically, that fill layer has the white box on the outside and then black in the center. So remember our blend modes. So if we have other interactions that we need that gold to stay visible, we can change this to linear dodge, right? Where it's white, it adds that result back in. We'll talk about this a lot more in the next lecture, I promise. So we'll move that back over. You could set this one to linear dodge as well. It'd probably be a little bit easier. Really depends. Let's go ahead and do the font, right? The text here. So unfortunately, this is a very limited feature in Painter. There are tools outside it. You know, we could use Photoshop to kind of create more specific designs, but in this case, I just need font. So the text tool is just called font. There is no text tool built in. We have to use one of these guys here. The only ones that are going to work are the ones that say substance in it, right? From this first row right here. So it is very limited. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another fill layer. We're going to call this text. I'm going to take one of these substances and I'm going to plug it in. I'm going to go ahead and use Font Courier Prime. Just drag and drop. Same problem. Substance covers the whole thing. We lose our line work. So I'm going to go ahead and do a linear dodge to add that back in. And we're going to turn repeat to none and start to scale this down. So now we can put this right where we need it. All right. Now I need to get this to fit a little bit more words, right? So we're going to go ahead and start typing this in. Now I'm going to let you guys do whatever you want. You can type in whatever text you want, have some fun with that. The more you make me laugh, the better your grade. So I'm going to do library of the world's best literature. Now notice that my text got cut off. So we do have some controls here. So the volume of that bounding box is constricting where we can see this. So if I start to push that text up in the Y position, I can fix that. But I can't really fix the X here, right? So I just need to take that size down just a bit. Now I can scale it up and down and get this exactly where I want it. Now, if you're paying attention, you can see of the is slightly smaller, right? So like, how do we do that? Easy. Remove that line, duplicate your text, put of the on the second line, and then make it smaller, right? And then of course, reposition that right where you need it. Ta-da, right? Sometimes it's just easier that way. You don't have to make it more complicated. All right, so that's that guy. So the text is very limited though. You won't have a lot of controls here, but this will work pretty well. And you can still move it. You can slightly rotate it, add some imperfections if you wanted to, give it some life, right? All right, so let's go ahead and add these little squiggly lines. Like, how are we gonna do this? Now, this we will use the paint layer. You could, if you're feeling savvy, do this exact same setup I'm about to show you with a fill layer. But I just want to show you how we can do this with a brush, okay? So if I have my brush, I have just a standard hard brush. We do have a lazy mouse option up here, which works just like you would anticipate from ZBrush, so it won't start drawing until you get to the edge, all right? But that's still going to be a very tough thing. Like that, there's a lot of frequency in that to try and recreate. So again, we're going to get a little bit more creative. So what I'm going to do is find a special brush. I'll turn off lazy mouse, and I'm going to search for curve. All right. And this line wave here is going to actually be able to reproduce this right here. Might not look it, but it can. I'll double click to load this into my brush. So there it is. Now, if I knew nothing else, right, I could at least look at my brush settings and I could play with them. So if I set the bend and the number to 1, I get something like that, maybe make it a little bit thinner. I could scale my brush down and I could do something like this, but that would be tedious. Very, very tedious, right? Don't want to do that. Instead, what I want to do is have a custom brush where I can just click, drag, and have it properly spaced out. And it's actually not that bad. So let's take a look at some of our brush settings. So if we click on this little icon here, these are all like little shortcuts. So if I go to the top, I go to my brush settings, I'm going to turn follow path on. So now my cursor or my brush follows the path of my cursor. But you can see it's already kind of rotated wrong. I need it to be rotated none. So I'm going to set that degree to 0. All right. Now I just need to fix the spacing. So let's see what we have here. Spacing. Here's 144. We're getting something that looks similar to stitching. So if you wanted to make stitching, this is one way we could do that. I'm going to set my stitching to 101. I'm going to click, hold shift, click again. Ooh, very close. Let's try 100. Click, hold shift. That should be sufficient. Let me scale the brush down a little bit more to the scale we need. Click, hold shift. That looks good. Now it's not a perfect representation, but that's going to be good enough, right? Let me make this a little bit thicker. And we'll make this a little bit bigger. Click. That feels appropriate, right? It's about the similar thickness there. Now, I don't want to have to recreate this brush every time I have to paint this. So if I right click, you can test your brush right here, by the way. But if I right click in this area, I can create a brush preset. So let's do it. There it is. Right click on that. Let's give it a name. Let's call it curly wavy line, something. And so now if we search for wavy line, look what comes up. If I double click on that, that'll load in all of my settings, and now I can just draw my lines. So now it's just a matter of getting this into position. So again, study your reference, see where these need to go, right, and draw them in. Just like that. Now, if I go over the edge a little bit, like if I just paint a little too far, just grab your eraser and just kind of paint that out, right? Obviously down here, that's a little too far, that's a little too far. Or you could paint in black, that's totally fine as well. And you just kind of repeat that process. So that's the gold. Now let's talk about this darker leather trim here. So it's just going to be an extension of what we've already done. So if I go into my leather group here, we have two layers we've been working with, the leather rough, right, and the leather itself. So what I want to do is have a darker variant that's a bit smoother than the leather, right? I need it to be not as bumpy, right? In fact, if you really study it, the spine is relatively smooth compared to the rest of the book, but we're not going to worry about that, right? We're just going to kind of get this leather to look somewhat good. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this leather, and you'll notice as soon as I duplicated it, the height, again, because it's additive, became more intense, right? It's adding itself on top of itself. So I'll go into my height channel, and I'm going to set this to normal. So it's no longer adding itself, but it still has its own identity. It still has its own kind of range, if you will. Let's name this dark, smooth leather. I'm going to go into the technical parameters here, and we're going to make some adjustments. I'm going to take this height range, and I'm going to scale this back. Range is the intensity of the height, right? So if I crank it, it's really, really strong. If I bring it down, I can remove all of the height, right? Now it's super smooth. Let's just give it just a hair, 0.002. I'm also going to go into my color and darken it. Now it is applied to the whole thing, but remember, we can mask this just like anything else. Right click, create a black mask. Let's paint in. Now I still have this other brush, so I'm just going to search for basic hard brush, which will reset our brush, and then we'll just paint in this area. All right, and so now where I paint, I get that smooth, darker material. So now it's just a matter of kind of fleshing that out a little bit. In fact, if I want to give the gold a little bit of height, I can go all the way back up to that gold group, boost the height just a little, just to give a little bit of depth. That looks real good. And then I would repeat this, right? I do the exact same thing. I can continue painting the leather down here and get that to look good as well. So you would just kind of carry on that process. Now, could you use a fill layer? What do you think? All right, if that makes it easier for you, make it easier for yourself, all right? I'm not here to show you, well, I'm here to show you everything I know, right? The best ways, but sometimes the best way is just to do it and get it done and not overcomplicate it, right? If a technique works, it works, okay? Now I want to create these little emblems, right? That kind of recess down, and these little lines that also recess down. So I'm going to need to make some additional adjustments. So again, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this dark smooth leather. And we're going to call this emblem leather. We're going to clear the mask, right? Because I don't want it to affect this area. I want to create a new area of effect. So I'm going to just go ahead and create a new black mask on top of that. And let's find an interesting alpha. Feel free to use whatever alpha you like, right? Experiment. I'm going to go with something that's like a bold shape here. In fact, if you want to find an image online, we'll kind of do that as well. I'll just show you with this image first. I think I'll go with, oh, I had it and it jumped. You know what? I like that too. Let's go with this shape. I'm going to scale that up. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do a fill layer. That way I can just quickly position this. So we'll go with this guy now that I changed my mind. Scale that down. It is tiling. We'll set that to none. You could do a paint layer as well. But I think this will be nice because I can get that consistent scale. So again, I have to kind of compare to my reference. That logo is going to appear a couple times. 1, 2, 3, and I think 4. Yeah, it is showing up about 4 times. So I would definitely have to leave some room there. Right there, right? And now if I look at this, it's not changing height, but if I go back to the material and go back into the technical parameters, remember that range we set to 0? We're going to leave that alone, right? Or 0.02. I'm going to bring the position. So this is going to offset that layer down in relation to everything else. So as I bring the position down, take a look at that. I don't have to go far. 0.02 is all I really needed there. That is super subtle. If you go super harsh with it, it's going to look terrible. I promise you. Subtlety is key here, right? 0.02, 0.01 will work. Oh, that's too subtle now. Oh, that's too strong. There we are. And then if I wanted to duplicate that, move that up, right? How convenient is that, right? Just works. In fact, I can kind of move this up into that little leather patch. It will erode because of the way my layer of operations is set up, because that leather rough is right on top of that component, right? So that works really, really well in that scenario. Okay. And then if I want to do the line work, it's no different, right? So if I add a paint layer, what I mean by line work, it's just these little lines, right? So I can just go in there, swap out my brush, or use a fill layer. It's up to you. Get a basic brush, scale that down to something that feels relative, and stamp that in. And because I'm already painting the visibility of a layer that's being pushed in, it looks correct, right? This is what makes Painter so powerful, because this entire time we've been painting with multiple elements: roughness, color, height, normal. Yeah, my spacing there was terrible. Now that I kind of look back at this, I think I would have definitely done a fill layer, because I can just easily modify it instead of just repainting it every single time. But, you know, honestly, from a distance, that's going to be fine. And this thing's probably imperfect as well. I doubt these lines are perfectly spaced apart, or even the same size. Like, that feels a little bit thinner. Now, if you want to bring in a custom texture, you are welcome to do so, right? So you can have custom text or a custom little alpha here. So let's see. I know a popular video game right now is Apex Legends, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to find the logo for Apex Legends, all right? Let's see what we have here. So let's search for logo. So think about how masks work. Think about the kind of color we need to bring into Painter. So I'm going to want something that's black and white. We do want to find something that's nice and high resolution, right? A small thumbnail is not going to look good. It's going to look pixelated. So this icon here looks appealing. I could probably make that work. Let's see. Let's filter by large. If we go to tools, we can do size and large. This could work really well. Let's do that. Oh, this could work too. Let's see. How big is this? 1000 by 1000. All right, I'm going to do this image. So I'm going to go ahead and just right click, open this image in a new tab. Oh, Pinterest. Ah, my enemy. Let's go away from Pinterest. Not a fan of Pinterest. This will work. Did they change it? Open image in new tab. There it is. That's what I want. Copy image. Did I not do that for the other one? No, I didn't. Okay. All right. Pinterest, you're okay. So if you, again, I accidentally clicked right click, open new tab. I meant to click image, right? So if you right click here and go to open image in new tab, you'll get the full resolution of the image, which is good, right? But I do need to make some modifications here, right? This is kind of inverted, and the grayscale here is a little off. I need this to be pure black and white. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this image, and we'll take this into Photoshop real quick and make some minor adjustments. Now, it would be in your best interest to make sure that the image is square, as it will become squashed if it's not. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to just go ahead and create new. Photoshop does support clipboard, so I didn't even download the image. It just recognized the fact that I had an image in my clipboard, and then I can just paste it right in there, all right? So let's go and make some modifications. I need this gray to be white, so I'm just going to add a levels tool, and I'm going to take this white point down. Now, if you don't understand that, don't worry. We'll talk about the levels in the future in quite a lot of depth. But if you could just find a black and white image, that'll work too. I'm going to check my canvas size here, make sure it's completely square. It's not. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust it. So I'm going to just say, we'll match the longest length with each other. So we get a little excess here. So I'm just going to create a black layer on the bottom. I'll just flood this layer. I'll do an edit and fill with black. Black. Done. Let's save this out. I'll just throw, actually, to be consistent, let's put it in our book project here. We're going to save this as a PNG. Now, this is changed in Photoshop. You can adjust this in your preferences. We need to save as a copy in order to save as a PNG. Super frustrating, but there's our PNG. And we'll call this Apex logo.png. I don't even think I put it in the right directory. I think it changed it on me. Yeah, sure did. So I'll go ahead and just copy and paste this and move it. Painter book and put it right in there. Now the cool thing is to bring this in, it's actually quite easy. If I click on this little plus icon down here, I can get the image import options, or if I'm real lazy, I can always just drag and drop and get the exact same thing. So you can actually bring in multiple images this way. So we're going to go ahead and define this. So I'm going to call this Apex. This way I can search for it, right? These are our search terms right here. I'm going to define it. Either it makes sense to either be a texture or B, an alpha, but this is just going to signify how this is going to be stored within the shelf, right? So in this case, alpha is suitable. For me, please do project as import your resources to. Current session just means the file will be available in this session of Painter and will be gone when you reopen it. Now, if you apply, it'll still be applied. It just won't be in your project. You won't be able to find it on your shelf. Project stores it within the file itself, and then library will be a permanent addition for your library. So any future project you start on will have access to that. Project will be fine. We'll click import. There it is. But if I lost it, I can always go into my project directory and see it right there. And so the cool thing is that because these little shapes are already set up, I can just swap out the texture. Apparently that was the other one. And it just updates. Right? So I can go in here, swap that texture out, and now I have my Apex logo right in there. And then I can rename this to a guide of how not to play Apex by yours truly.